She didn't walk up to that door with pride. She walked up to it with shaking hands, a horse she loved more than anything in this world, and $3.25 in her coat pocket. She knocked once. Then she looked down at Ranger, that beautiful chestnut horse her dying father had pressed his hand against, and she whispered, "I'm sorry." When the door opened, she looked the man straight in the eye and said the hardest words she had ever spoken in her 26 years of life. "Please, just buy my horse for $10. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Clara Whitmore rode out to Daniel Hart's ranch. The sky was the color of old pewter, flat, heavy, and pressing down on the Colorado foothills like a hand that had grown tired of holding itself up. She didn't notice the sky. She noticed the way Ranger's breath came out in small white clouds in the cold air. She noticed the way his ears twitched when she tightened her grip on the reins. She noticed the familiar warmth of him beneath her, that steady, rolling rhythm she had known since she was a girl of 14, when her father led a young chestnut colt out of the barn and said, "He's yours, Clara. Take care of him." She had taken care of him for 12 years. And now she was riding him to the one man in the valley who might give her $10 for him. Not 100, not 200, not the 350 that old Bill Dawson at the trading post said he was worth on his worst day. $10. Because $10 was all she needed to keep from losing everything else. Clara had not always been the kind of woman who rode to strangers' doors with her hat in her hand 2 years ago, before the winter that broke everything. Before the doctor's bills piled up like split wood outside a cabin door, before a man named Silas Crow smiled at her across a table and offered her a loan she didn't fully understand. Clara Whitmore had been something close to proud. Not arrogant, not reckless, but proud in the quiet, daily way that a person is proud when they wake up every morning knowing that what they have, they earned. Her father, Robert Whitmore, had homesteaded 60 acres in the foothills of the Rockies in 1872, back when the land was still young and angry and beautiful all at once. He had broken that ground himself, built the first fence himself, lost 3 fingers on his left hand to a saw in 1878, and kept working the next morning. He had raised Clara alone after her mother died of fever in 1881. He had taught her to ride before she could read, taught her to read before she started school, and taught her to keep accounts before she was 12 years old. "The land doesn't care if you're tired," he used to say. "It only cares if you show up." Clara had always shown up, even after her father's cough started in the spring of 1889. A dry, pulling sound at first that they both pretended was nothing. Clara showed up. She showed up when the cough became something worse. She showed up when the doctor came out from Denver and used words she had to ask him to spell. She showed up when her father started sleeping 18 hours a day and stopped being able to walk to the fence line. She showed up at his bedside every evening for 11 months. And when Robert Whitmore finally let go on a Tuesday morning in February 1890, Clara was holding his hand. She was 24 years old. She was alone on 60 acres. And she had no idea how bad things were about to get. The debt hadn't started with Silas Crow. It started with the harvest of 1889, the one that failed before it began, the one where late frost killed the garden plot in May and a summer drought baked the pasture down to pale yellow stubble by July. It started with the medical bills. Dr. Harlan had been generous, more generous than Clara ever expected. He let her pay in installments, never pressed her, never sent a collection man to the door. But the bills were real, and they were large, and they came due the same season her income dried up. It started with the fences. 2 sections of the north fence collapsed in the winter storms of early 1890, and Clara's 3 remaining cattle drifted onto Harmon Pruitt's land. Harmon Pruitt was not a generous man. He charged her $12 for the inconvenience, and kept one of the cattle as what he called fair compensation. And then it started with Silas Crow. She had met him at the county office in March 1890, 6 weeks after burying her father. She had gone to ask about a deferral on the land taxes, Just 60 days. Just enough time to sell some of her late father's tools and pull together what she owed. Silas Crow was standing near the clerk's window, and he overheard. He was a well-dressed man. Soft hands, clean boots, a pocket watch that caught the light when he moved. He introduced himself as a private lender who specialized in helping families through difficult transitions. He explained the loan in patient, reasonable-sounding language. He wrote the terms on a piece of paper. He pointed to the numbers and said, "You see, it's straightforward." What Clara saw was $50 to cover the taxes and a small operating amount to get through the spring. What she missed, because she was exhausted and grieving and had not yet learned that men like Silas Crow counted on exactly that, was the compounding interest clause buried in the second paragraph. She signed, and then she spent the next year and a half working harder than she had ever worked in her life, and somehow, impossibly, the debt never went away. It shifted. It grew. It changed shape like a shadow depending on the time of day. She sold goods. She delivered supplies. She took in mending. She sold 3 pieces of furniture from the house. She sold the second horse, the old gray mare named Pearl, and felt sick for a week afterward. She made payments. Every single payment. Silas Crow acknowledged with a polite nod and a piece of paper that showed her she somehow still owed more than she had the month before. By the spring of 1891, she had paid him back nearly 3 times what she borrowed, and she still owed him $10. $10. That was the number Silas Crow had given her on the morning of April 14, 1891, when he arrived at her ranch gate on his gray gelding and sat there looking down at her the way a cat looks at something it has already decided it owns. "You have until sunset," he said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "After that, I file with the county. It is not personal, Miss Whitmore. Business is business." Clara had looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "How much do I have?" she said. $3.25, if I remember correctly from your last submission." He remembered correctly. "I need $6.75 by sunset," Clara said. $6.75, yes. He tugged at one glove and straightened it. "I do hope you find a way." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. Clara stood at her gate for a long time after the sound of his hooves faded. She looked at the ranch. At the fence she had repaired herself last fall. At the barn her father had built in 1875. At the house where she had been born, where her mother had died, where her father had taken his last breath in the back room. 60 acres. That was all. 60 acres and a horse. And she was not going to lose the 60 acres, which meant she had to think very hard about the horse. She had gone through every other possibility first. That was important to her, even if no one else would ever know it. She needed to know she had tried everything before she tried this. She had gone to Harmon Pruitt and asked if there was work she could do to earn $6 by evening. He had looked at her from under his hat brim and said, "Nothing that wouldn't take a week." She had gone to the Hendersons at the dry goods store and asked if they needed anything done. Inventory, cleaning, deliveries. Mrs. Henderson had shaken her head with an expression that was kind, but helpless. "We just don't have the cash on hand, Clara. I'm sorry." She had thought about the saddle, whether the saddle alone might fetch $6. But everyone in the county knew that saddle was worth maybe $3 at most, and that was with someone in a generous mood. She had thought about the tools in the barn, her father's good adze, the block and tackle, the set of chisels he had kept wrapped in oilcloth for 20 years. She had stood in the barn doorway and looked at them for several minutes. Then she had looked at Ranger, and she remembered what her father had told her. Only once, in the last clear week before he got truly bad. He had taken her hand and said it quietly, like he was telling her something he wanted to make sure she would keep. "If the day ever comes when you must part with Ranger," he had said, "take him to Daniel Hart. He's the biggest ranch in the valley. He knows the value of good things. He'll treat you fair." Clara had not wanted to hear those words then. She did not want to need them now. But she saddled Ranger, counted out her $3.25, tucked it into her coat pocket, and rode. She had never been to Hart Ranch before, but she knew where it was the way everyone in the county knew where it was. You simply rode toward the best-kept fence line you could see, and eventually you arrived. The property was larger than she expected. The gate was iron, set between two posts of good solid timber, and there was a sign above it, burned into a piece of oak board, that read simply, Hart. No first name, no flourish, just Hart. She liked that. She stopped at the gate. Her hand didn't shake when she reached for the latch. She was proud of that. She rode through. A man came out of the barn before she reached the house. He was tall, taller than she expected, and he moved with the kind of economy that comes from years of physical work. Not hurried, not slow, just deliberate. Like every step had a reason. He had dark hair starting to go gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a plane. He was wiping his hands on a cloth as he walked toward her, and he was looking at Ranger, not at her. That was the first thing she noticed about Daniel Hart. He looked at the horse first. A man who looks at the horse first either loves horses or knows them, she thought. Either way, that's something. He stopped a few feet away and looked up at her. His eyes were gray, or some color close to gray, and direct in a way that Clara found either reassuring or unsettling. She wasn't sure yet which. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was even, not unfriendly, not particularly warm either, just present. Clara dismounted. She had rehearsed this moment on the ride over. She had planned to explain things in order, the debt, the timeline, the amount, before asking. She had planned to be measured and factual and unemotional because she understood that if she let herself feel it, she wouldn't be able to speak. She dismounted. She stood in front of Daniel Hart. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not what she had rehearsed. "Please," she said, "just buy my horse for $10. The silence lasted long enough that Clara heard Ranger shift his weight behind her. Daniel Hart looked at the horse. Ranger was a fine animal, and no one who knew anything about horses could look at him and think $10. He was sound in all four legs, good in the chest, clear in the eye. On a decent day at any trading post in the county, Ranger would bring $150, maybe more if the buyer had taste. Daniel Hart clearly knew this. He looked back at Clara. "Why 10?" he asked. She had told herself she would keep the explanation short. She had told herself she would give him only what he needed to make a decision. She told him everything. She didn't plan to. But once she started, it came out in a way she hadn't expected. Not tearful, not desperate, just honest. The loan. The compounding interest she hadn't understood. The failed harvest. The cattle she lost. The $3.25 in her pocket. The sunset deadline. The 60 acres her father had built with his own hands. She looked at Daniel Hart's face while she talked. She watched to see if he was impatient or bored, or if he had the expression some men got when a woman talked about money. That slight tightening around the eyes that said you shouldn't have let it get this far. He didn't have that expression. He just listened. He stood with the cloth still in his hands, and he just listened. When she finished, there was another silence. Then Daniel Hart said, "I don't want to buy your horse." Clara felt it hit her like cold water. She had expected negotiation. She had expected him to try to work the price down, maybe offer 8, maybe ask for the saddle included. She had not expected a flat refusal. She swallowed. She kept her voice level. "I see," she said. "Thank you for your time." She reached for Ranger's reins. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "I said I don't want to buy your horse," Daniel Hart said. "I didn't say I won't help you." She turned around slowly. I was looking at her with that same direct gray gaze, and there was something in it she couldn't quite name yet. Not pity. She would have recognized pity, and she would have gotten back on Ranger and ridden away from it. It wasn't pity. It was something more like recognition. Like he was looking at her and seeing something specific. "I need to tell you something about this ranch," he said. "Come sit down." She did not want to sit down. Sitting down felt like agreeing to something before she knew what it was. But she sat. They sat on the bench outside the barn. Not in the house, which she appreciated, because the house would have felt like stepping into his territory. And Daniel Hart told her about his problem. The ranch was profitable. The cattle business was as solid as anything in the county. The land was well managed, the herd was healthy, and Hart Ranch had a reputation that buyers respected. But the operations behind that success were a disaster. "I have 3 men who handle supply runs," he said, "and not one of them has ever written down what they spent or what they brought back. I have an accounts ledger that hasn't been updated since last September. I have invoices from 3 suppliers that I'm fairly certain are wrong, but I can't prove it because I have no records to compare them to. And last month I discovered that I've been paying for a feed delivery every 2 weeks for a barn I don't use anymore." He said all of this without apparent embarrassment. Just facts, stated clearly. "I don't need more cattle," he said. "I need someone who knows how to run the part of a ranch that isn't cattle." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you a position," he said. "There's a difference. A job is something you do until something better comes along. A position is something that matters to the operation. And the $10 would be an advance on your first wages." Clara looked out at the fence line. She looked at Ranger, standing where she'd tied him, his dark ears forward, watching her. She thought about what it would mean to ride home tonight with $10 and her horse and 60 acres still in her name. She thought about what it would mean to owe Daniel Hart something. "I don't take charity," she said. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering work. Skilled work that I have not been able to fill because the people I've interviewed don't know the difference between a payable and a receivable." "How do you know I do?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something in that direction. "Because," he said, "you just told me that Silas Crow's compound interest structure meant you paid nearly 3 times your principal, which means you can read a contract. And you've been calculating what you owe against what you've paid month by month, which means you keep accounts in your head. That's more than my last 3 hired hands combined." Clara looked at him. He looked back. "I want a contract," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. "Wages agreed in writing before I start." "Agreed. And the advance comes out of the first month's pay. I'm not starting in debt to you." "That's how an advance works, yes." She was quiet for a moment. She didn't want to say yes, not because the offer was wrong. It was, in fact, the most reasonable thing anyone had offered her in 2 years. She didn't want to say yes because saying yes meant she had needed help. And she had spent 2 years trying very hard not to need it. But she thought about Ranger. She thought about the sound of her father's voice saying, "He knows the value of good things." Maybe her father hadn't meant the horse. "Fine," Clara said. She held out her hand. Daniel Hart shook it once, firmly, without ceremony. "Can you be back here in 3 hours?" he asked. "Why 3 hours?" "Because you need to go pay Silas Crow before sunset," he said. "And I need to write you a contract before you leave, so we both know this is real." Clara almost said something then, some version of thank you that rose up in her throat, and then stopped it. Because he hadn't said it to be thanked. He'd said it because it was practical. She decided she respected that. She went inside and signed a contract with Daniel Hart. He handed her a $10 bill. She rode to Silas Crow's office and paid $6.75, folded the change carefully back into her coat pocket, and rode home. She put Ranger in the barn. She stood there for a long time with her hand on his neck, in the quiet and the smell of hay. "We're all right," she told him. She wasn't sure yet if she believed it, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt possible. She was back at Hart Ranch the following Monday at 7 in the morning. She brought a ledger she had bought with 50 cents of her own money, 3 sharpened pencils, and the quiet, coiled energy of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something useful to do. Daniel Hart met her at the barn. He handed her a ring of keys. "Supply room, account room, and the feed storage," he said. "I'll introduce you to the men." "How many?" "6 full-time, 2 seasonal, 1 cook. Do any of them know I'm coming? Yes. Do any of them have opinions about it? He looked at her evenly. Probably. Good, she said. That means they're paying attention. He almost smiled again. She went to work. What Clara found in the account room was not exactly a disaster. It was something more specific than that. It was the record of a man who was excellent at the thing he loved and had quietly ignored the thing he didn't. Daniel Hart understood cattle. He understood land and weather and the way a herd moved and what a sick animal looked like 3 days before anyone else noticed. He understood equipment and the kind of repairs that lasted versus the kind that fell apart by spring. What he did not understand, or more precisely, what he had never bothered to sit down and learn, was the quiet arithmetic of everything surrounding those things. The supply invoices were the first thing she found. She spread them across the table in the account room and went through them one by one. It took 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, she pushed back from the table and went to find Daniel Hart. He was at the South Corral. You have 2 suppliers billing you for the same load, she said, without preamble. He turned around. What? March 11th, Hendricks Feed and Murphy Brothers. Same weight, same feed type, same delivery date. You paid both invoices. He stared at her. How much? He said. $14. Is it a mistake or is someone... I don't know yet, Clara said. I need the driver's logs for March. Do you keep them? Somewhere, he said. He had the expression of a man who was not used to being caught out. Not angry, more like genuinely surprised at himself. Find them, Clara said. I'll start on April. She went back inside. Behind her, she heard one of the ranch hands, a young man named Cutter, who had watched her walk past 3 times that morning, with the look of someone waiting for an excuse to find her inadequate. Say something she wasn't supposed to hear. Boss is gonna let a woman run the books? She heard Daniel Hart's answer, quiet and flat. She found $14 in 3 hours. What did you find this week? Clara kept walking. She did not smile until she was back inside the account room, with the door closed behind her. By the end of the first week, she had found $63 in billing errors. By the end of the second week, she had restructured the supply schedule so that 2 of the 3 regular runs were unnecessary, saving the ranch roughly $8 a month in wages and feed for the delivery horses. By the end of the third week, she had fired 1 supplier and renegotiated rates with a second. The ranch hands stopped watching her with skepticism somewhere in the middle of the second week. They started watching her with something else, something she recognized slowly, because it had been a while since she'd felt it directed at her. Respect. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that shows itself in small things. Someone holding a door, someone waiting to hear what she said before making a decision, someone asking her opinion before acting. She was careful not to let it go to her head, but she was also careful not to pretend she didn't notice. Daniel Hart, for his part, said very little. He was there when she arrived each morning and there when she left each evening. He reviewed everything she gave him, asked clear questions when he had them, and made decisions quickly. He did not second-guess her. He did not look over her shoulder. He did not explain things to her that she hadn't asked him to explain. He treated her, in short, like someone who knew what she was doing. Which sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Clara had dealt with enough men in the last 2 years, lenders, suppliers, county clerks, neighbors, who had talked to her carefully, the way you talk to someone who might not fully understand, who had simplified, who had leaned forward slightly, as if closing a distance she was too slow to cross herself. Daniel Hart did not do that. He just talked to her, like she was a person who had information he needed, and his job was to listen and respond. It was, she realized one evening while riding Ranger home, the way her father had always talked to her. She had not realized until now how much she had missed it. It was on a Thursday evening at the end of her 4th week that something happened that she had not planned for. She was leaving the account room with her ledger under her arm when she passed the open door of Daniel Hart's study and heard him on the telephone with someone, and then realized, from 2 words she caught, that the someone was Silas Crow. She stopped outside the door. She did not mean to listen, but she heard her name. And then she heard Daniel Hart's voice. Still even, still unhurried, still that same flat quality that gave nothing away. Say, "I'm aware of the situation, Mr. Crow, and I'm telling you now, as a professional courtesy, that Miss Whitmore is employed here, and her financial records are no longer in the state you seem to be imagining. I would suggest you verify your own records before contacting her again." A pause. "That is not a threat," Daniel Hart said. "That is information. There is a difference." Another pause. "Good evening." She heard him set the phone down. She stood in the hallway for a moment, not moving. Then she walked to the door and knocked once. He looked up. "I heard," she said. He didn't look away. "I know." "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said. "I didn't." "Then why?" "Because Silas Crow was about to contact you again with a new claim," Daniel Hart said. "And I know how those conversations end. They end with you owing him something that you don't owe, and Silas Crow standing on your property with a piece of paper and a smile." Clara looked at him. "How do you know how those conversations end?" Something moved across his face, just briefly. "Because," he said, "he did it to my father 20 years ago." The silence in the room was different after that. It had a different texture, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with something unspoken. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." She said it quietly, and she meant it, and she left before he could tell her it was nothing. Because she didn't want him to say it was nothing. It hadn't been nothing. And she suspected Daniel Hart knew that too. She rode home that evening with Ranger's hooves steady beneath her, and the last of the April light spreading across the hills in long red stripes. She thought about the telephone call. She thought about her father's name on the deed to 60 acres that was still hers. She thought about a well-dressed man with clean boots and a pocket watch who had smiled at a grieving 24-year-old girl and handed her a piece of paper that took 2 years to pay off. She thought about a man with graying temples and direct gray eyes who had heard her say, "Please buy my horse for $10, and had said, "I want to offer you something better," and had meant it. Not in the way people mean things when they want something in return. In the way her father had meant things. Like the words and the intention behind them were the same thing. Ranger tossed his head once, and Clara loosened the reins. "I know," she said, the way she always did when he did that. She didn't know what came next. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid of it. And that, she decided, was enough for tonight. The Monday after the telephone call, Clara arrived at Hart Ranch 7 minutes early. She had not planned to arrive early. She had planned to arrive exactly on time, the way she always did, because arriving on time was a statement. It said, "I am here because I agreed to be here, not because I have nowhere else to be." But she had been awake since 4 in the morning, lying in the dark of her father's old house with her eyes open, turning something over in her mind that she could not quite put down. Daniel Hart had called Silas Crow on her behalf without asking her first. She had said thank you and meant it. She still meant it. But somewhere between thanking him and riding home and lying awake at 4 in the morning, the gratitude had developed an edge, not sharp enough to be anger, but present enough to be something she needed to look at directly. She didn't like decisions being made for her, even good ones, especially good ones maybe, because the good ones were harder to argue with, and she had spent enough of her life watching men make good decisions on behalf of women who hadn't been consulted and calling it care. She tied Ranger at the post near the barn and walked to the account room without looking for Daniel Hart. She opened the ledger to where she'd left off. She picked up her pencil. She put it back down. She sat there for approximately 45 seconds before she pushed back the chair, walked down the hall, and knocked on the door of his study. "Come in." He was already at his desk. The lamp was lit. He had a cup of coffee and a set of papers spread in front of him, and he looked like a man who had also been awake for a while. Clara closed the door behind her. She stood in front of his desk and said, "I need to say something." He set down the paper he was holding. "All right. What you did with Silas Crow, calling him. I understand why you did it. and I'm not saying it was wrong. But, he said. But I need you to ask me first, she said. Before you do something like that. Before you make a decision that involves my name or my business or my situation. I need you to ask. She watched his face. He didn't look defensive. He didn't look dismissive. He looked, if anything, like someone receiving information they intended to actually use. You're right, he said. She had expected more resistance. She had prepared, on some level, for more resistance, and his lack of it caught her slightly off balance. I acted on what I knew, he said, without thinking about whether it was mine to act on. That was presumptuous of me. Yes, Clara said. It was. It won't happen again. She looked at him for a moment. You mean that? I generally say what I mean, he said. It saves time. Something in Clara's chest loosened, just slightly. She gave a single nod. All right then. She turned to leave. Miss Whitmore. She stopped. For what it's worth, Daniel Hart said. I called Crow because I've watched what men like him do when they decide a woman is alone and cornered. I've seen it before. I wasn't trying to take something away from you. I was trying to make sure he understood there was someone paying attention. She stood with her hand on the door frame. I understand that, she said quietly. And I believe you. She went back to the account room. She picked up the pencil. She went to work. But she thought about what he'd said for the rest of the morning. Someone paying attention. 4 words, and they sat in her chest and refused to move. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had been paying attention. She hadn't realized until now how much weight she'd been carrying in the silence of that. The trouble with Cutter started on a Wednesday. Cutter's full name was Emmett Cutter, and he was 22 years old, strong enough to throw a bale of hay one-handed, and absolutely certain that he understood how things worked at Hart Ranch better than anyone who had arrived less than 2 months ago. He had been with the ranch 3 years. He was Daniel Hart's most reliable hand with the cattle. He was also, Clara had observed, the kind of young man who measured his own worth by how small he could make everyone around him feel. She had been managing him carefully, giving him clear requests, keeping her language direct, never softening her instructions with apology. It had been working, in the way that careful management of a pressurized situation always works, steadily until it doesn't. It stopped working on a Wednesday when she discovered that a supply order she had restructured 2 weeks ago had not been submitted the way she'd written it. She had asked Cutter to take the revised order to Murphy Brothers on his last supply run. She had handed it to him in a sealed envelope. She had written the delivery address on the front. Murphy Brothers had received an entirely different order. The old one, the one she had replaced, the one that included the unnecessary items she had already negotiated out. She found out when she went through the incoming invoice and the numbers didn't match. She went outside. Cutter was at the corral fence. She walked up beside him and said quietly, "The order I gave you for Murphy Brothers, what happened to it?" He didn't look at her. "Delivered it." "You delivered the wrong one." Now he looked at her. "I delivered what you gave me." "What I gave you was a sealed envelope with a revised order inside it. Murphy Brothers received an unsealed copy of the previous order, the one I replaced." He shrugged. The shrug was slow and deliberate, the kind that's designed to communicate a complete absence of concern. Maybe there was a mix-up. Emmett. He turned his head slightly at the use of his first name. "I'm not asking you to confess to anything," Clara said, her voice level. "I'm telling you what I've found, and I'm telling you that it is going to cost this ranch money, and I am going to have to fix it. And I'm telling you that if something like this happens again, I will go directly to Mr. Hart." Something flashed in Cutter's eyes. Not quite anger, but close. "You think I care if you go to Hart?" "I think," Clara said, "that you've been here 3 years, and you're good at your work, and you'd like to keep this job. And I think you're smart enough to know that the easiest way to keep it is to do what I ask, correctly, the first time. So yes, I think you care." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back inside. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. She corrected the Murphy brothers' order herself that afternoon, wrote a letter of explanation to the supplier, and absorbed the 14-cent difference in her own notes rather than submitting it as a loss. It was a small amount. It wasn't the point. The point was that the books would balance, and they would balance because she made them balance. She told Daniel Hart about it that evening when he came to review the week's accounts. She told him plainly, without editorializing, what she'd found, what she believed had happened, what she had done to correct it, and what she had said to Cutter afterward. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Do you want me to handle it?" She shook her head. "I already handled it." "Then I'll leave it with you." She paused. "You're not going to ask me what I said to him?" "Should I be concerned about what you said?" "No." "Then no," he said. "I'm not going to ask." That was the moment. She identified it later, looking back, when she began to understand that Daniel Hart's version of trust was not the soft, reassuring kind. It was the practical kind, the kind that shows itself not in words, but in what a person chooses not to do. He chose not to second-guess her. Every single time, he chose not to second-guess her. She was starting to understand how rare that was. Cutter made one more attempt. It came 2 weeks later, in the form of a conversation in the supply room that Clara walked in on between Cutter and one of the other hands, a quieter man named Roy, who mostly kept his head down and did his work. She heard Cutter say, "Woman comes in here 2 months ago with a horse and a hard luck story, and now she's running the books. You don't find that funny?" She heard Roy say nothing. She stepped through the doorway. Both men looked at her. She walked to the shelf where the inventory records were kept, took down the file she needed, opened it, and began reading. There was a silence. Then she said, without looking up, "Emmett, I need the April supply log on my desk by end of day." A pause. "Yes, ma'am," Cutter said. She found the number she was looking for, closed the file, and walked out. She never mentioned it to Daniel Hart. She didn't need to. By the end of that week, Cutter started leaving the supply logs on her desk before she asked for them. Some battles, she had learned, are not won with confrontation. They are won with consistency. They are won by showing up so reliably, for so long, that the argument against you simply runs out of air. She had been learning that lesson for years. She was getting quite good at it. The thing she hadn't expected, the thing that caught her genuinely off guard, the way only things you haven't prepared for can, was that she was happy, not loudly, not in any way that announced itself. But somewhere in the second month of working at Hart Ranch, she noticed that she was waking up in the morning with something in her chest that felt like forward momentum, and that she was going to sleep at night without the specific, grinding anxiety that had lived between her ribs for 2 years. She was useful. Specifically, concretely useful, in ways she could see and measure. The books balanced. The costs were down. The suppliers were honest because they knew someone was checking. The ranch ran smoother, and she had made it run smoother, and she knew that, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first time in years she felt like herself. But there was a complication. The complication was that the more time she spent at Hart Ranch, the more difficult it became to treat it as purely a working arrangement. Not because of anything inappropriate. Nothing like that had ever entered the picture, and she suspected Daniel Hart was not the kind of man it would enter the picture with uninvited. But because the ranch was starting to feel familiar. The rhythms of it. The sounds. The particular way the late afternoon light came through the account room window and made everything look warmer than it was. She caught herself sometimes thinking about it on her ride home, the way you think about somewhere you belong. And that was dangerous. Because she didn't belong here. She belonged on 60 acres in the foothills, with her father's name on the deed and Ranger in the barn. That was the point of all this. That had always been the point. She was not going to lose sight of the point. She was firm about that. She was very firm. In the middle of May, the weather turned ugly. It came fast, the way it does in Colorado in spring. 2 days of warm sun and then a north wind that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an afternoon, followed by 3 inches of wet snow, that sat on everything and refused to melt. The roads became miserable. The ride to Hart Ranch, which was 8 miles from her property, became slow and cold and genuinely uncomfortable. She made it every day without comment. On the 4th day of bad weather, she arrived to find Daniel Hart waiting outside, which he did not usually do. "You rode in that," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's passable," she said, dismounting. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her first name. She registered it without letting her face show that she'd registered it. "The roads are going to get worse before they get better," he said. "There's a house on the property, northeast corner, near the old fence line. It's empty. It's clean. It has a stove and a bed and more room than a person needs." "I'm fine," Clara said. "I know you're fine," he said. "That's not what this is about." "What is it about?" "It's about the fact that you're riding 8 miles in dangerous conditions every morning and 8 miles back every evening, and there is a perfectly functional house 40 yards from where we're standing that nobody is using. It would look—" "I know how it would look," he said. "I don't particularly care how it looks. I care that you arrive in one piece." Clara looked at him. "I'd pay rent," she said. "You would not." "Then it's not practical." "Clara." There was something different in his voice now, not impatient exactly, but stripped of its usual reserve, as if he was setting something down he'd been carrying. "A home is not a debt. Staying somewhere safe while the weather is bad does not mean you owe anyone anything. It means you made a sensible decision. People will talk. People already talk," he said. "They talked when you took the job. They'll talk regardless of where you sleep. You can't manage other people's conversations. You can only manage your own decisions." She stared at him. She wanted to argue with that. She turned it over, looking for the weak point, the place where she could push back. She couldn't find one. "1 week," she said. "Only until the road's clear." "Agreed," he said immediately. "And I want to see the house first." "Of course. And if I don't like it—" "Then you go back to riding 8 miles in the dark," he said. "That's your right." She liked that he said that. She liked it more than she wanted to admit. She saw the house. It was small and clean and had a good stove and a window that looked east, which meant she would see the sunrise. There was a barn nearby for Ranger. "Fine," she said. She moved in the next morning. She told herself it was temporary. The house was quieter than she expected. She had been living alone for over a year, the ranch house on her own property, which should have been quiet, which was quiet technically. But that silence had always had a quality to it that she could only describe as waiting. Waiting for something to go wrong. Waiting for Silas Crow's next envelope. Waiting for the next fence that needed fixing. The next account that didn't balance. The next problem she had to solve alone. The small house on Hart Ranch was quiet differently. It was quiet because nothing was wrong. She lay in the narrow bed on the first night and listened to that quiet, and felt the specific novelty of it. The absence of that low-frequency hum of dread she had stopped noticing because it had been there so long. She was asleep before 9 o'clock. She slept for 9 hours. She woke up, disoriented, briefly afraid. Then she heard Ranger moving in the barn nearby, and she remembered where she was, and she lay still for a moment and let herself just be still. Dad, she thought, not as a sentence, just his presence, the way he was always there at the back of her mind. "I don't know what this is, but I think it might be all right." She got up and started the stove. The 1 week became 2 weeks when the weather didn't break. And then the conversation happened that changed everything. It was a Saturday evening. She wasn't working Saturdays officially, but she had gone to the account room to finish something that had been nagging at her, and she was there later than she intended. And by the time she came out, the light was low, and Daniel Hart was sitting on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee, the way she had started to notice he did in the evenings. He held up the pot in a silent question. She hesitated for only a second before sitting down. He poured her a cup. They sat in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable. She had noticed early on that Daniel Hart was one of those people who did not feel the need to fill silence, who treated it, in fact, the way you treat a room that's already occupied, with a kind of natural respect. She was the one who spoke first. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," he said. "Silas Crow and your father. What happened?" I was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitant kind of quiet, but the deliberate kind. The kind where someone is deciding how much of the truth is necessary. 1871, he said. "My father had a good year, and then 2 bad ones, the way it goes." Crow was working under a different name then. Had a partner, ran it as a lending firm out of Denver. My father borrowed $200 to bridge the gap. And paid back $430 over the next 4 years, and still owed money at the end of it. He said it without heat, the way you state a fact you've had long enough to examine from all angles. My father was a proud man. He never told anyone. Not the sheriff, not a lawyer, not a neighbor. He just kept paying, and working, and paying. Did he lose the land? No, Daniel Hart said. He didn't lose the land. A pause. He lost his health, the stress of it. 4 years of that weight. He looked out toward the fence line. He died in 1876. I was 23. I took over the ranch. Clara was very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "So when you walked up to my gate," he said, "asking to sell your horse for $10, with that particular look on your face." "What look?" He turned toward her slightly. "The one that says you've been fighting something alone for so long that asking for help feels like losing." Clara said nothing. "I recognized it," he said. "That's all." She looked at her coffee cup. "Daniel." She didn't plan to use his first name. It came out because it was the only right thing. The formal Mr. Hart would have been a wall, and the moment didn't have room for a wall. He waited. "I'm not your father's story," she said. "I understand why you saw it that way, but I need you to see me as my own." He looked at her for a long moment. "I do," he said quietly. "I did from the beginning." "Then why?" "Because sometimes seeing someone clearly means you can see the danger around them more clearly too," he said. "And I have never been good at watching someone walk toward something I already know the ending of." She held that. She turned it over. She thought about how different that was from pity. Pity looks down. What Daniel Hart was describing looked straight across. "Ask me first," she said again. "Whatever you see coming, ask me first." "I will," he said. And this time she heard something in it that wasn't just agreement. It was a kind of commitment, small and solid, like a stone placed with intention. They sat there until the light went completely. Neither of them moved to go inside, and something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with the sudden clarity of lightning, but the way a river changes course, slowly, through pressure and time, and the quiet, irresistible movement of water, finding the place it was always going to go. The next morning, everything was different, not in a visible way. She arrived at the account room. She opened the ledger. She picked up her pencil. Cutter left the supply log on her desk at 7:45 without being asked. Roy nodded at her in the hallway. The ranch ran the way it had been running for weeks. But something had settled. She had stopped bracing. She had been bracing since the day her father died. For the next problem, the next bill, the next person who would look at her and see either an inconvenience or an opportunity. She had been coiled against impact for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply stand upright without holding anything in. She didn't understand yet what exactly had happened on that porch. She wasn't sure she needed to understand it yet. What she knew was that the small house on Hart Ranch still felt temporary, technically, and she was still planning to go home when the roads cleared, and she was still absolutely certain about who she was and what she was there for. What she knew was that she was starting to trust someone. And she had not done that. Not really, not without conditions, in a very long time. She wasn't afraid of it. That was the most surprising part. She sat in the account room of a ranch that was not hers, with a ledger that was not hers, looking at numbers that had started to feel like something she owned anyway. Not legally, not on paper, but in the way that work you do with your whole self always belongs to you a little, regardless of who signs the deed. She thought about her father's 60 acres waiting for her 8 miles east. She thought about Daniel Hart's face in the low evening light, saying I recognized it. She picked up her pencil. She went back to work. She had a feeling, moving through her chest like the first real warmth of spring through a window you forgot to close, that things were about to get more complicated. And for the first time in 2 years, she found she didn't mind. The roads cleared on a Tuesday. Clara knew because she could hear it. The sound of the world outside changing. The drip of ice releasing its grip. The creak of things returning to themselves after being held too long in one position. She had been at Hart Ranch for 3 weeks. 1 week had become 2, 2 had become 3, and somewhere in there she had stopped counting with the particular urgency she'd started with. She told Daniel Hart that morning over the account books. "The roads are passable," she said. "I'll move back to my property this weekend." He looked up from the invoice he was reviewing. "All right," he said. That was it. No argument. No performance of disappointment. Just, all right. She went back to the ledger. She told herself she was relieved. She spent the next 4 days being very busy and not thinking about it. On Friday evening, she packed her 2 bags and carried them to the small barn where Ranger was stabled and stood there looking at the neat stall, the clean hay, the bucket of fresh water. Someone. She suspected Roy, who had developed a quiet, unannounced habit of doing small things for her, had placed at exactly the right height. She scratched Ranger behind the ear. "We're going home," she told him. He pressed his nose into her shoulder. She left first thing Saturday morning. She didn't make a production of it. She knocked on Daniel Hart's study door, told him she would see him Monday, and rode out. She told herself the tightness in her chest was the cold air. It was not the cold air. Her own house was exactly as she'd left it. Of course it was. She had only been gone 3 weeks, not 3 years. The bed was where she'd left it. The table was where she'd left it. The view from the kitchen window was the same pale early summer sky over the same fence line she had repaired herself with wire and blistered hands. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and waited to feel the relief of being home. It came. Eventually. It took longer than she expected. She made a fire in the stove, put water on for coffee, and sat at the table. The silence was the old kind again, the waiting kind. She noticed it immediately, the way you notice the return of a sound you'd stopped hearing because it was always there. The low-frequency anxiety had not gone anywhere. It had just been temporarily drowned out by the noise of useful work in a place that needed her. She drank her coffee. She looked at the walls her father had built. She thought, I am glad to be here. I am glad this is mine. Both of those things were true, and underneath them, stubborn and inconvenient and completely uninvited, was something else. She missed the small house on Hart Ranch. She put down the coffee cup. She stood up. She went outside and checked the fence line because there was always something on the fence line that needed checking, and physical work was the most reliable remedy she knew for inconvenient emotions. She found 3 loose posts and fixed them. By the time she came back inside, she had made a decision. She was not going to spend any more time thinking about this. She had a job. She had 60 acres. She had Ranger and a functional stove and a father's name on a deed. Those were the things that mattered. She was going to be very focused on the things that mattered. She went to bed at 8:30. She lay awake until after midnight. Monday morning she arrived at Hart Ranch at exactly 7 o'clock, not a minute early, not a minute late. She was halfway down the hall to the account room when Daniel Hart came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and held one out to her. She stopped. He held the cup steadily, without ceremony, the way you hand something to someone you simply expect to take it. She took it. "Thank you," she said. "The Henderson account came in over the weekend," he said. "I left it on your desk. I'll look at it this morning." "There's something else." He paused, and she recognized the particular quality of that pause, the brief but deliberate kind that meant what came next was not routine. "I had a conversation with Tom Garrett on Saturday." Tom Garrett was the county land officer. Clara knew his name because his office was the one that handled land tax records, which meant his name had appeared in several of the more anxious chapters of her recent life. She held the coffee cup. And? He mentioned your property, Daniel said. Specifically, he mentioned that the back taxes from 1889, the ones you paid through the Crow loan, were recorded incorrectly. There's a clerical error in the county record that shows a remaining balance. Clara went very still. How much? She said. $11. That's not right. I have the receipt. I know you do. Garrett knows it too. He said it's correctable, but it needs to be done in person with the original documentation. Clara let out a long breath. Fine, I'll go this week. I can go with you. I'll go, she said again, and the firmness in her voice was not quite sharp, but it was clear. He heard it. He nodded once and said nothing more about it. She went to her desk. She found the Henderson account. She opened it. She made herself read the numbers. $11. A clerical error. Something correctable. She told herself it was nothing. But her hand wasn't quite steady when she picked up the pencil, and it took her several minutes to settle into the rhythm of the work, and she was angrier than the situation warranted. Not at Garrett, not even at the error, but at the fact that 2.5 years after Silas Crow had smiled at her across a table, his ghost was still walking around in her records creating small disasters she had to clean up. She put the pencil down. She picked it back up. She worked. She went to the county office on Wednesday. She brought every document she had. The original loan receipts, the payment records, the letter from Silas Crow acknowledging the final payment, the discharge notice from the county from the previous year. Tom Garrett was a round-faced man of about 50, with a methodical manner and an office that looked like someone had once organized it and then given up. He received her documents with the careful attention of someone who understands that errors in his office cause real pain in other people's lives, and he had the decency to look genuinely apologetic about it. It's a transcription error from 1890, he said, turning the pages. Whoever recorded the payment entered it under the wrong parcel number. Can you correct it today? I can correct the record today, he said. The formal amendment takes... He caught her expression. I'll put it at the top of the queue, he said. You should have confirmation by end of week. Thank you, Clara said. She was gathering her documents when Garrett said, in the tone of someone mentioning something he considers secondary. I should note, there was an inquiry on your parcel last week. Clara's hands stopped moving. What kind of inquiry? Someone asked about the ownership status, whether there were any outstanding liens or disputed claims. Who? Garrett looked at his notes. A Mr. Crow. The room was very quiet for a moment. Did he file anything? Clara said. No, he only asked. But he came to your office and asked about my property. Yes. Clara looked at the man across the desk with an expression she was working very hard to keep neutral. And you're telling me this because it's public record that he asked, Garrett said carefully. And I thought you'd want to know. She wanted to say several things. She said none of them. She thanked Garrett, took her documents, and walked out. She stood outside the county office on the wooden sidewalk and breathed carefully for a moment. Silas Crow had been to the county office asking about her land. She owed him nothing. He had no claim. She had the receipts, the discharge, the documentation. She owed him absolutely nothing. But men like Silas Crow didn't ask questions at county offices because they had legitimate interests. They asked questions because they were looking for angles. Because they were checking whether the door was still open, whether the lock had a weakness, whether the person on the other side had let their guard down. She rode back to Hart Ranch faster than she usually rode. She told Daniel Hart when she got back. She told him plainly, the way she always delivered information. Facts first, interpretation second, emotion kept in its appropriate place. She told him what Garrett said about the clerical error and what Garrett said about Crow's inquiry. And she watched Daniel Hart's face go through something while she talked. Not anger exactly, something slower and colder than anger. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" Not, "I'll handle it." Not, "Let me make some calls." Just, "What do you need?" She registered this. She held it alongside all the other moments she had been carefully cataloging without meaning to. I need to know whether he has any remaining legal avenue, she said. Any claim he could legitimately bring. Do you have everything in order? Every receipt, every discharge, the original contract and all payment records. Then there's no avenue, Daniel said. Crow knows that. He's not checking because he thinks he has a case. He's checking because men like him always check, on the chance that something has changed. Something did change, Clara said quietly. There was a clerical error in the record. Daniel looked at her. He knew about that? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe he was looking for exactly that kind of thing. The silence between them tightened. Clara, Daniel said carefully, I want to say something, and I want to ask you first if it's all right. She looked at him. Go ahead. I know a lawyer in Denver, a good one, someone who handles exactly this kind of bad faith harassment from predatory lenders. I'd like to suggest you speak with him. Not because I think you're in danger of losing anything. You're not. But because having proper legal counsel document Crow's pattern of behavior would protect you going forward. And it would cost you nothing because Harlan Brooks works on contingency for cases like yours. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're asking, she said. I'm asking. She thought about it. She turned it over honestly, without the reflexive resistance she'd had in the beginning. That first defensive wall that went up whenever anyone suggested help. All right, she said. I'll speak with him. Something in Daniel Hart's face changed. Just slightly. Like something he'd been holding carefully had been set down. Thank you, he said. She shook her head. Don't thank me. I'm doing it because it's practical. I know, he said, and almost, smiled. She met with Harlan Brooks 2 weeks later in Denver. He was a dry, precise man of about 60, with a silver watch chain, and the manner of someone who has spent decades listening to people describe their worst moments, and has learned to receive that information without adding his own weight to it. He read her documents in 40 minutes without looking up. Then he looked up. You have an airtight case, he said. Not just for the defense of your title, for a harassment claim against Crow, if you wanted to pursue it. I don't want to pursue anything, Clara said. I want to make sure he can't come back. That I can guarantee, Brooks said. He pulled a piece of paper toward him. He's done this before, Miss Whitmore. Your situation isn't unique. He operates the same way in every case. Identifies someone vulnerable, makes the loan, uses the compounding structure to ensure they can never fully pay it off, then circles back years later when he thinks the documentation has degraded or the person has moved on. He paused. The clerical error at the county office, that was likely not a coincidence. Clara stared at him. You think he arranged it? I think Garrett's office is underfunded and overworked, and that a man who knows where to look and what questions to ask can sometimes accelerate certain kinds of administrative errors. He met her eyes steadily. I can't prove it, but I've seen his pattern 4 times now, and this is consistent with it. She sat very still. She thought about the moment she had signed that document. A grieving 24-year-old with $3.25 in her pocket and her father 6 weeks in the ground. And a well-dressed man with a pocket watch had looked at her and seen not a person in need of help, but a resource to be harvested. She thought about how long she had been angry at herself for being naive. She was done being angry at herself. What do I need to do? She said. Brooks told her. It took another hour. When she walked out of his office, she had a plan, a timeline, and the first genuine legal protection her property had ever had. She stood on the street in Denver and breathed the city air for a moment. Then she wrote a short note and sent it ahead by messenger to Hart Ranch. It said only, "It went well. Back by evening." She didn't know why she felt the need to tell him. She only knew that she did, and that she had stopped fighting the small, quiet impulse to let someone else know where she was. She was back before evening. Daniel Hart was at the fence near the South Corral when she rode in, and he turned when he heard Ranger's hooves. He didn't say anything, just looked at her with that particular directness, and she understood it was a question. Crow won't be coming back, she said. Not legally. Not in any other way he can make stick. He nodded once. Good. She dismounted. There's something else. He waited. Brooks thinks the error in the county record wasn't entirely accidental. That Crow may have helped it along somehow. Daniel Hart was very still for a moment. He's sure? He can't prove it, but he's seen the pattern before. A long pause. Something moved through Daniel Hart's face that she had not seen there before. Something harder than his usual reserve. Something with old roots. My father never knew, he said quietly. He always believed the debt just grew on its own, the way bad luck does. I know, Clara said. I spent a long time being angry at him for trusting the wrong person. Did you stop? He looked at her. Eventually, when I realized that blaming the person who got hurt is the easiest way to avoid being angry at the person who did the hurting. She held that. She held it for a long time. I blamed myself, she said, for signing without reading closely enough. I know you did. I'm trying to stop. You should, he said simply. You read the contract. He built it to deceive. Those are not equal failures. She looked at him across the fence rail. Daniel. Yes. You're a good man, she said. Not as a compliment. As a statement of fact, delivered the same way she would report a number in a ledger. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I'm trying to be. Chatan. It was the last week of June when everything broke open. Not badly. Not the way things had been breaking open for 2 years. Not with loss or threat or the particular cold dread of a letter from a county office. It broke open the way a sky breaks after a long storm, suddenly and with too much light. It started with Roy. Roy came to the account room on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Clara had learned to recognize as the precursor to something important. Miss Whitmore, he said, I need to tell you something. And I need you to know I'm telling you because I think it's right, not because I want anything for it. She put down her pencil. Sit down, Roy. He sat. He turned his hat in his hands twice. Then he said, When you first came here, the order for Murphy Brothers that Cutter said he delivered wrong. Yes. It wasn't a mix-up, Roy said. He took the envelope you gave him, steamed it open, swapped the order for the old one, and resealed it. Clara looked at him. I saw him do it, Roy said. I didn't say anything because I don't know why I didn't say anything. I've been thinking about it since. He looked at his hat. I think I was afraid of him, which is a poor excuse. Why are you telling me now? Roy looked up. Because I watched you fix what he did, without blaming anyone, without making it worse than it was. And I watched him respect you for it. And I think... He stopped. Tried again. I think the right thing done late is still better than not done at all. Clara was quiet for a moment. Does Cutter know you're telling me this? No. Are you prepared for the possibility that he'll find out? Roy nodded. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him steadily. Thank you, Roy. That took something. Yes, ma'am. He stood up, put his hat back on. Are you going to tell Mr. Hart? Yes, she said. I am. Roy nodded and left. Clara sat for a moment. Then she stood, walked down the hall, and knocked on Daniel Hart's study door. She told him everything Roy had told her. Plainly, completely, including her own handling of it at the time and what she had said to Cutter. Daniel Hart listened without a word until she finished. Then he said, What do you think should happen? She thought he was being considerate, asking her opinion out of the habit of respect they'd built between them. Then she looked at his face and understood he was asking because he genuinely didn't know, and he wanted her read on it. Cutter did something dishonest, she said. He did it deliberately, and he did it because he didn't respect my authority here. But he's corrected his behavior. He's been reliable for 2 months, and Roy coming forward cost him something. I don't want that cost to destroy the dynamic he's built. So? So I think you speak to Cutter, directly. Tell him you know. Give him the chance to account for himself. And then let him stay, conditionally, if his accounting is honest. Daniel Hart looked at her for a long moment. You're more generous than most people would be. I'm practical, she said. A man who's been caught and then given the chance to be honest tends to be more loyal than one who's never been tested. He held her gaze. That's wise. It's my father's philosophy, she said. He said punishment that ends in shame creates resentment. Accountability that ends in dignity creates character. Daniel stood up. He went to find Cutter. Clara went back to the account room. 40 minutes later, she heard Cutter's voice in the hall. Not the words, just the tone, which moved through several registers she recognized. Defensiveness, then something quieter, then silence. She kept her eyes on the ledger. An hour after that, Cutter appeared in her doorway. She looked up. He was holding his hat. His jaw was tight. He looked like a man who had been through something and was still deciding how to carry it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Emmett. I'm sorry." The word came out like it had been sitting somewhere uncomfortable for a while. "What I did was wrong. I knew it then, and I know it now." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, it was." I know you won't," she said. "Because if you do, you'll be gone. We both understand that." He nodded. He was about to leave when she said, "Emmett." He stopped. "You're good with the cattle," she said. "You know this ranch. Those things matter. Don't waste them on proving a point about me." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Something younger than his usual expression. Something that looked a little like embarrassed relief. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. He left. That evening was the one where Clara found it. She had been looking for the quarterly records from the previous year. Not anything dramatic, just reconciling some figures. And she had opened the bottom drawer of the account room cabinet where old records were stored, and she had found, under the 1890 folders, a piece of paper that wasn't a ranch record. It was a receipt, a county land tax receipt, for her property, her name, her parcel number, her address. Dated March 1891, paid in full. She stared at it. She looked at the amount, $3.40. The remaining balance on that year's taxes. The small amount she had been paying in installments. The amount she had almost finished, but hadn't quite cleared by the time the snow came and she moved to the small house. $3.40, paid by Daniel Hart. Without telling her. She sat very still with that piece of paper in her hand for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked to his study. She opened the door without knocking. He looked up. She put the receipt on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. She said, "Explain this." He didn't pretend not to know what it was. He looked at it for a moment, and then back at her. And something in his face that was usually controlled was not entirely controlled. "Your taxes were going to go delinquent again," he said. "The clerical error was still unresolved and you were traveling to Denver and I knew the deadline was—" "You paid my taxes," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and very level. "Without asking, without telling me." "Yes. After I told you. After we had the conversation. After you said you understood." "Yes," he said again. And this time, there was something in it that wasn't excuse. It was acknowledgement. Plain and without defense. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the usual control in his voice was entirely absent. What was left was something much simpler and much more honest. "Because I didn't want you to lose it," he said. "I know that's not a reason. I know it doesn't justify the decision. But you asked me why, and that's the truth of it. I was afraid you'd lose your father's land over $3.40 while you were doing something brave, and I couldn't sit with that." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him. She looked at the man who had heard her say, "Just buy my horse for $10, and had refused. The man who had given her work with dignity instead of charity with shame. The man who had called Silas Crow without asking, and then accepted her correction, and never done it again. The man who had said, "Ask me anything," and I'm asking, "And what do you need?" and then done this. She was angry. She was genuinely angry. Not performed anger, not strategic anger, but the real kind that comes from feeling like the ground has shifted under you without warning. And underneath the anger, quiet and persistent and inconvenient as a spring coming up through rock, was something else entirely. "You were wrong," she said. "I know. I had it under control. I believe you. You made a decision about my land without asking me. Yes, and I am sorry. He paused. Clara, I am genuinely sorry. Not because it turned out to matter, because it was not mine to do. Your autonomy over your own life is not something I get to override when I think I know better. That's... He stopped, started again. That's what men like Crow do. They decide they know better. I refuse to be that person, and I wasn't thinking clearly. She looked at him for a long moment. Refund me, she said. He blinked. What? $3.40. Take it from my next wages. He nodded immediately. Done. She stood there another moment. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the tight, defensive kind, the kind that's really about fear. It had become something more open, something that had room in it. Why do you care so much? She said. It wasn't the question she'd planned to ask. She didn't know she was going to ask it until it was already in the air. Daniel Hart looked at her, and for the first time since she had walked through his gate with a horse she couldn't afford to keep, and a pride she couldn't afford to lose, she saw him without any of the careful reserve. Just the man underneath it, looking at her the way you look at something you have been trying very hard not to say out loud. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet and very even. I think you know why, he said. Clara stood in the doorway of his study with $3.40 between them and 2 years of her life behind her and 60 acres of her father's land waiting 8 miles east. She stood there, and she did not walk away. She stood in that doorway for a long time, long enough that the lamp on Daniel Hart's desk flickered once and settled. Long enough that somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted in the barn, and the sound of it carried through the walls like a reminder that the world was still moving even when a person wasn't. I think you know why. She did know. That was the problem. She had known for weeks, had been knowing it in the careful, peripheral way you know something you aren't ready to look at directly. She had filed it under impractical and complicated and not the point, and she had gone back to her ledgers and her invoices and the clean, manageable arithmetic of accounts that balanced. But arithmetic doesn't help you when a man looks at you the way Daniel Hart was looking at her now, she said. I can't. He didn't move, didn't change expression, just waited. I have 60 acres, she said, and a job that I earned, and a reputation in this county that I rebuilt from nothing, and every single one of those things exists because I kept them separate from anything that could make them conditional. I'm not asking you to make anything conditional. You don't know that, she said. You think you're not. But if this... She stopped, started again. If this becomes something and it goes wrong, I lose the job. I lose the easy access to the legal help I just secured. I lose the... She paused, because the next word was harder. I lose whatever this is, this thing we've built here, and I can't afford that. I cannot afford another loss of that size. Daniel Hart stood up slowly from his desk. He didn't come toward her. He just stood, which somehow made the room feel smaller anyway. You're describing what happens if it goes wrong, he said. What happens if it goes right? She opened her mouth, closed it. I'm not pressuring you, he said. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, but I want you to answer that question. Not for me, for yourself. What happens if it goes right? She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. I don't know, she said honestly. That's the fair answer, he said. It's not good enough. For now it is. She left. She rode home in the dark, something she almost never did. But the need to move was stronger than the need for safety, and Ranger knew the road by now the way she knew her own heartbeat. She let him find the rhythm, and she sat in the saddle and let the night air and the sound of his hooves do the work of thinking. She had told the truth, both parts of it, the fear and the not knowing. Both were real, both were hers, both were things she needed to carry for a while before she could put them down. She got home. She put Ranger in the barn. She went inside. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark for 20 minutes before she lit the lamp. Then she made a decision. She was not going to make any decisions tonight. She was going to go to sleep, and she was going to go to work in the morning, and she was going to do her job with the same competence and consistency she had shown for 4 months, and she was going to trust that clarity would come when she had earned it. She went to sleep. She did not sleep well, but she went. The next morning was the hardest one. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. She arrived at Hart Ranch at 7. Daniel Hart was in the barn. He came out, saw her, said good morning in exactly the same tone he always used, and went back inside. That was it. No awkwardness. No loaded silence. No performance of normalcy that called attention to itself. Just, good morning. Like a man who had said an honest thing and was prepared to let it settle at whatever speed it needed. She found that she could breathe again. She went to the account room. She opened the Henderson file she'd been working through. She picked up her pencil. And somewhere around 9 in the morning, with the familiar scratch of numbers and the comfortable logic of a ledger that was starting to balance, she felt the tight thing in her chest release its last grip. She was not going to fall apart over this. She was Clara Whitmore. She had held a dying ranch together for 2 years on $3.25 and sheer determination. She could certainly handle complicated feelings for a man with gray eyes and good judgment. She had faced worse. She would figure this out. The pencil moved. The numbers lined up. The morning passed. Cutter knocked on the account room door at 11. She looked up, genuinely surprised. He stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested this was costing him something he wasn't sure he could afford. "Roy said you take it black," he said. She did not smile. But something near her eyes did something involuntary. "Roy is correct." He set the cup on the edge of her desk, carefully, as if it were a peace offering being placed on an altar, and started to leave. "Emmett." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He gave a single nod and walked away. She heard his boots go down the hall and out through the side door, and she sat there for a moment, looking at the cup of coffee like it was a small, improbable miracle. People surprised her sometimes. She was grateful for that. July arrived the way Colorado summers always did. Without apology, hot and immediate, turning everything bright and then brighter still. The ranch was at full pace. Cattle moved, supplies ran, accounts filled with the particular density of a busy season. Clara was in the middle of it, and she was, despite everything, in her element. She had restructured 3 supplier contracts in June. She had found a pattern of overbilling from a Denver feed company that Daniel had been using for years, brought it to his attention with documentation, and they had terminated the contract and replaced it with a closer supplier at a savings of $22 a month. She had hired a part-time bookkeeper, a young woman named June Aldis, the schoolteacher's daughter, who turned out to have a sharp mind and a faster pencil than Clara, to help manage the increased volume. The ranch ran better than it had in years. Daniel said so once, plainly, the way he said most things, and then said nothing more about it. He didn't need to. The accounts said it. The supplier's behavior said it. The way the ranch hands moved through their work said it, with a coherence, a sense of shared purpose, that had not been there in April. Clara had done that. She knew it. She was proud of it. Not in a way she announced, in a way she carried quietly, like a warm stone in her pocket. And still, under all of it, the conversation in his study sat like a weight she kept picking up and setting down. What happens if it goes right? She had been trying to answer that question for 3 weeks. She kept getting partway to an answer, and then finding that the answer scared her. Not in the way that bad things scared her, but in the way that very good things scared her when she was afraid of wanting them too much. She had wanted to keep her father's ranch too much. She had wanted her father to live too much. She had wanted so many things with the full, unguarded capacity of a person who doesn't yet know how completely things can be taken away. She had learned to want more carefully. But careful wanting, she was beginning to understand, was its own kind of loss. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to her at Hart Ranch, which meant whoever sent it knew she was here, which was information in itself. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and unfamiliar, and the return address was Denver. She opened it in the account room. It was from Harlan Brooks. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to Daniel Hart's study and knocked. "Come in." She put the letter on his desk. He read it. His face did nothing visible, but she was becoming very good at reading the invisible things, and she saw his jaw tighten and then deliberately release. "Crow filed a civil claim," she said, "against me, alleging—" She stopped. The words still felt ridiculous. "Alleging that the payment I made in April 1891 was short, and that the $3.40 Harlan found in the county records represents a still existing debt, and that this debt somehow, through a legal argument I don't entirely follow, gives him a right to dispute my title." Daniel Hart looked up from the letter. "He filed this after Brooks contacted him." "Yes. So Brooks's outreach confirmed to Crow that you were building a case, and he moved first." "That's what it looks like." Daniel Hart set the letter down very carefully on his desk. He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted, without meaning to, and then he said, "Call Brooks today, this afternoon. He'll know what this is." "I already wrote the reply," Clara said. "I'm sending it when I leave here." He looked at her. "What did you say?" "That I received the filing, that I have complete documentation, that I will be represented by counsel, and that I intend to countersue for harassment and bad faith litigation if this proceeds." She paused. "I was very polite about it." Something moved through Daniel Hart's expression. Something she had not seen there before. Something that looked, if she wasn't mistaken, like pride. "Good," he said. "There's something else," she said. "Brooks says in the letter that Crow's claim, while legally baseless, could create a cloud on the title that would take months to clear. During that time, technically, I cannot sell the property or borrow against it." "You weren't planning to do either." "No, but it means he can hurt me without winning. That's the point." She looked at the letter. "He knows he can't take the land. He's trying to make it cost me something anyway." "Clara." Daniel Hart's voice was quiet. "This is not going to work. You know that." "I know," she said. "But I also know what it felt like 2 years ago when his name showed up in correspondence, and I need you to understand that this is harder than it looks from the outside." "I know it is." "I'm not afraid," she said. Then, more honestly, "I'm angry." "Good," he said again. "Stay angry. It's the right response." She looked at him across the desk. She thought about what he'd said 3 weeks ago. "I think you know why." She thought about her own answer. "I don't know what happens if it goes right." She was still figuring that out. But standing here, in his study, with a legal threat in her hand and no trembling in her voice, she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. Daniel Hart had never once looked at her as someone who needed protecting. He looked at her as someone who could handle things and chose, when given the choice, to handle them with him rather than alone. That was different from what she'd been afraid of. That was something else entirely. The counterfiling went in the following Monday. Harlan Brooks was, as advertised, very good. The response was clear, thoroughly documented, and included a formal complaint against Crow for filing a knowingly fraudulent claim, which, Brooks explained in a letter to Clara, would not necessarily succeed, but would cost Crow time and money, and, more importantly, would send a message that this target intended to fight back on every front simultaneously. "He's accustomed to people who wear down," Brooks wrote. "You are not wearing down. He will recalculate." Clara read that line 3 times. "You are not wearing down." She folded the letter and put it in the account room file where she kept her personal documents. Then she pulled out the ledger and went back to work. 2 days later, something happened she hadn't anticipated. The news traveled. She didn't know how. She hadn't told anyone except Daniel, and she was nearly certain Daniel hadn't spread it. But this was a small county, and lawyers talked to clerks who talked to shopkeepers who talked to neighbors, and by Thursday afternoon when she rode into town for supplies, she was aware of a different quality in the way people looked at her. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Henderson came around the counter and said quietly, I heard about Crow. I'm glad you're fighting it. At the post office, an older man she recognized as a longtime rancher named Halsey touched the brim of his hat and said, Crow got my brother-in-law in '84. Nobody stood up then. Glad someone's standing up now. She didn't know what to do with that. She thanked them and went back to Ranger and rode home with the weight of it sitting strange and new on her shoulders. She had been so focused on surviving, on holding the line, on staying upright, that she hadn't considered the possibility that what she was doing might matter to anyone other than herself. She thought about that for a long time. It was Daniel who told her about the meeting. He found her in the account room on a Friday morning. She knew from his knock that it wasn't routine, because his routine knock was twice, and this was 3 times, closer together. Come in, she said. He came in. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, the one she'd come to think of as his chair, though she'd never said so. And he said, 3 ranchers in the county want to meet with you. She put down her pencil. About what? About Crow, Halsey, the Brennan brothers, and a woman named Margaret Dole who ranches east of here. All of them have history with him, some directly, some through family. They want to talk about a coordinated complaint to the state land commissioner. Clara stared at him. They came to you, she said. They came to me because they didn't know how to approach you directly. But it's you they want, Clara. You're the one with current active counsel. You're the one with documentation going back to the original loan. He paused. You're the one who's fighting. She sat with that. A coordinated complaint, she said slowly. If there are multiple complainants with documented patterns, Brooks thinks it changes the nature of the case entirely, Daniel said. From a civil dispute to a regulatory matter, which is a different kind of pressure on a different kind of authority. Did you talk to Brooks about this already? No, I'm telling you first, because you asked me to. She looked at him. He held her gaze, steady and patient as always, and she thought, he is the most consistent person I have ever known. Not in a boring way. In the way that bedrock is consistent. The kind of consistency that makes everything built on top of it possible. Set up the meeting, she said. I'll send the letters today. Here, or your choice, he said. She thought about it. Here, at the ranch, where I work. She paused. I want them to see that I'm not hiding. He nodded. He stood up to leave. Daniel. He stopped at the door. How long have you known about these 3 ranchers? About their history with Crow? A very slight pause. Since February. Before I came here. Yes. You didn't mention it when I came. No. Why? He turned around and looked at her. Because you didn't come here to fight Silas Crow. You came here to save your horse and your ranch, and that was already enough. I wasn't going to add someone else's war to your plate when yours was already full. She looked at him for a long moment. But now, she said. Now your plate is different, he said simply. And you can decide for yourself what you want on it. He left. She sat there for a while after the sound of his footsteps faded. She thought about a 24-year-old girl signing a document she didn't fully understand. She thought about 2.5 years of compound interest and failed harvests and $3.25 in her coat pocket. She thought about walking up to a gate with a horse she loved and nothing else and saying please. And now she was sitting in a room she had reorganized, behind a desk that ran a ranch more efficiently than it had in years, with a lawyer in Denver who had already cost Silas Crow money and 3 other people who wanted to stand beside her. She had come here to save what was hers. She had not expected to save anything beyond that. She picked up her pencil. She started drafting a list of every document she had that demonstrated Crow's pattern of behavior, not just for herself, but in a format that could be shared, that could be used by 3 other people who had suffered the same pattern and never had the right words to describe it until now. She worked for 3 hours straight. She didn't notice the time passing. The meeting happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks later. Margaret Dole arrived first. She was a small, precise woman of about 60, with white hair pinned severely back, and hands that looked like they had been working outdoors for 4 decades because they had. She shook Clara's hand with a grip that communicated respect and evaluation simultaneously. "I heard you found a good lawyer," she said. "How much is he costing you?" "Contingency," Clara said. "Smart," said Margaret Dole. Halsey and the Brennan brothers arrived together, the brothers talking over each other in the way of men who have spent too many years in close proximity to successfully maintain separate opinions. They were respectful, direct, and clearly relieved to be in the same room as other people who knew exactly what it felt like to watch a compound interest clause eat your savings alive. Daniel Hart stayed in the background. He had arranged chairs in the main room off the hallway, offered coffee, and then removed himself to the far end of the room where he stood quietly with his own cup and said nothing unless someone spoke to him directly. That restraint, Clara thought. That particular restraint. She ran the meeting. She had prepared a one-page summary of her documentation and a proposed framework for the joint complaint. She presented it without preamble, asked for their reaction, and listened to their corrections and additions with her pencil moving. It lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Margaret Dole said, "You've done this before, run a meeting like this." "No," Clara said. "But I've been running accounts for 4 months, and accounts are just another version of the same thing, finding the pattern and deciding what it means." Margaret Dole smiled. It transformed her face completely. "I like you," she said, as if this were useful information Clara might want to have. "Thank you," Clara said. "I hope I've earned that." "You have," said Halsey. "My brother-in-law's land is gone. His family moved north. If we'd had someone willing to stand up—" He stopped. Better late than not at all. She walked them out. She shook hands with each of them. She watched them ride away. She stood on the porch for a moment in the early evening air. Behind her, she heard Daniel Hart's quiet footstep, and then he was standing beside her, not too close, just present. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Like I've been carrying something alone for a long time and just handed part of it to people who are strong enough to hold their share." "That's what it is," he said. She turned to look at him. And she did something she had not planned to do, had not rehearsed, had not given herself permission to consider. She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the porch rail. She held it there for just a moment. His hand was warm and still. She took her hand back. "I owe you an answer," she said quietly, "to the question you asked me." He waited. "What happens if it goes right?" she said. "I've been trying to answer that for 3 weeks, and I think the reason I couldn't was that I kept asking it as a hypothetical, as a thing that might happen in the future that I needed to evaluate before committing." She paused. "But it's not hypothetical. It's already happening. Right now. Whatever this is. This has been going right since April." He was very still. "I'm not saying I'm ready for—" She stopped, started again. "I'm saying I see it. I see what you are and what you've done and how you've done it, and I'm not looking away from it anymore. Whatever comes next, I'm not looking away." For the first time since she had known him, she saw Daniel Hart look like something had been set free in him. He didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He just looked at her with that direct gray gaze, and the thing she saw in it was so unguarded that she had to look away for a second to give herself somewhere to put the feeling. When she looked back, he said, "Thank you for telling me." "Don't make it into a big thing," she said. "I won't," he said. And then, so quietly she almost thought she hadn't heard it. "It's already the biggest thing." She went home that evening with the feeling still warm in her chest, and she sat in her father's kitchen at her father's table, and she thought about the deed on the wall with his name on it and her name beside it. "This was always yours," he had told her about the ranch before he died. "I only helped you keep what you already earned." She had thought he was talking about the land. She understood now he had been talking about herself. The joint complaint went to the state land commissioner in August. Harlan Brooks filed it with 4 names and 47 pages of documentation. He told Clara it was, in his professional experience, one of the more comprehensively prepared complaints he had submitted in 30 years of practice. "You will likely not hear from Silas Crow again," he wrote. Men of his particular type recalibrate when the cost exceeds the benefit. You have made yourself considerably more expensive than he budgeted for. Clara read the letter at her desk at Hart Ranch. She put it in the file with the others. She went back to work. But that afternoon, at 4 o'clock, when she was finishing the last column of the quarterly accounts, she heard the specific sound of Daniel Hart's boots in the hallway, and then his knock. Twice, the regular knock. And she said, "Come in," and he came in and set a small wrapped package on the corner of her desk without a word. She looked at it. She looked at him. "What is this?" "Open it," he said. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. She unwrapped it. It was a small framed piece of paper. She looked at it for a long moment before she understood what she was looking at. It was the original $10 bill. The one he had given her on the day they met. He had framed it behind glass with a small piece of white card beneath it. And on the card, in his handwriting, 3 words. Not a debt. She sat there. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in the account room. She was absolutely, categorically not going to do that. "This was the advance," she said, when she was sure her voice would hold. "You deducted this from my first month's wages." "Yes." "So why?" "Because I went to the bank and replaced it," he said. "And I framed the original because—" He paused. "Because that piece of paper is the reason 2 people are standing in this room right now, and I thought it deserved better than a drawer." She looked at the frame for a long time. Then she looked at him. "You are," she said, "without question, the most unexpected person I have ever met." He considered this. "Is that a good thing?" "Yes," she said. "It is the best possible kind of thing." She set the frame carefully on the corner of her desk, where she could see it from her chair. She had come to this ranch with a horse she couldn't bear to sell, and a pride she couldn't afford to lose. She had not come looking for this. But she was Clara Whitmore. She had learned, more than once, that the things you didn't come looking for were sometimes the ones you had needed most all along. She picked up her pencil. She went back to the accounts. The numbers lined up. Everything balanced. The State Land Commissioner's response came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Clara was in the account room when Daniel brought her the envelope. He didn't open it. He didn't hover. He set it on the corner of her desk, right next to the framed $10 bill, and walked back out without a word. She looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly, making sure every word meant what she thought it meant. It did. The commissioner had accepted the joint complaint. Silas Crow's civil claim against her title had been formally dismissed as frivolous and filed in bad faith. Additionally, the commissioner had opened a regulatory investigation into Crow's lending practices across the county. All 4 complainants named, 47 pages of documentation entered into official record. At the bottom of the letter, in the dry, careful language of a government official, who nonetheless understood what he was writing. The complainants are commended for the thoroughness and courage of their documentation. This office will proceed accordingly. Clara set the letter down. She sat very still. She thought about April of 1891. She thought about $3.25. She thought about riding to a gate she had never been through before, with a horse she loved more than was practical, and a pride that had been beaten down, but never broken. She thought about her father's voice. He knows the value of good things. He had not been wrong. She stood up. She walked out of the account room and down the hall. She pushed open the door to the barn where she knew Daniel was working, because she knew his schedule now, the way she knew the rhythm of her own breathing. He looked up. She held out the letter. He read it. She watched his face. He was very controlled, always, but she had become fluent in the language of small movements, the slight release around his jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in his shoulders. He looked up from the letter. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then something happened that she had never seen before and would remember for the rest of her life. Daniel Hart smiled. Fully, without reservation. The kind of smile that a person keeps in reserve because it's too real for casual use, and when it appears, it changes everything about a face. She had not known his face could do that. She stood there absorbing it like sunlight after a long winter. "I need to tell Margaret Dole," she said, because she needed to say something practical before the feeling in her chest became ungovernable. "I already sent a rider to Halsey," he said. "He'll pass the word." She shook her head. "Of course you did." "Is that?" "No," she said. "That's right. That's exactly right." She looked at him. "You're learning." "I've had a good teacher," he said. She took the letter back. She folded it carefully, more carefully than necessary, her hands needing something deliberate to do. She walked back to the account room. She opened the drawer where she kept her most important documents. The deed copy, the Brooks correspondence, the original loan receipts, and she placed the commissioner's letter on top. She closed the drawer. She picked up her pencil. She could not, for the life of her, remember what she had been working on before he brought the envelope. She sat there for a full minute, pencil in hand, looking at numbers she could not process. Then she put the pencil down, leaned back in her chair, looked at the ceiling, and let herself feel it. All of it. Every month of grinding anxiety. Every payment she had scraped together. Every morning she had woken up already exhausted by what the day was going to ask of her. The night she had stood in her barn and looked at Ranger and understood that she might have to give him up. The ride to a gate she had never been through before. The man who had said, "I don't want to buy your horse." She let herself feel all of it, from the beginning to this moment, like turning the pages of a book she had lived chapter by chapter, without ever being able to see the shape of the whole thing. The shape of it was remarkable. She was not the same woman who had ridden up to that gate. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. Then she sat up, picked up the pencil, and found her place in the ledger. She had accounts to finish. Margaret Dole came to Hart Ranch the following Saturday. She arrived unannounced, which Clara had come to understand was simply how Margaret Dole operated, because a woman who had ranched 60 acres alone for 30 years had long since stopped organizing her life around what other people expected. Clara was in the yard when she arrived. Margaret dismounted with the efficiency of someone who has been getting on and off horses for 6 decades and doesn't think about it anymore. And she walked directly to Clara and held out her hand. Clara shook it. "I got Halsey's message," Margaret said. "I wanted to come and say it to your face." "Say what?" Margaret Dole looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone. "That you did something I didn't think one person could do. You made Silas Crow answerable. 30 years he's been operating in this county. 30 years. And it took one woman with a ledger and a lawyer and the sheer refusal to be worn down." Clara shook her head. "It took 4 people. It took you," Margaret said. "The 4 of us were just waiting for someone to show us it was possible." Clara didn't know what to do with that. She was quiet for a moment. "My father lost 3 fingers building the fence on his property," she said finally. "He went back to work the next morning." Margaret looked at her. "I thought about that a lot," Clara said. "In the bad months. I thought, he didn't stop because it hurt. He stopped when it was done." She paused. "It's done now." Margaret Dole nodded slowly. "What's next for you?" It was a simple question. It was also the question Clara had been quietly turning over for weeks, now that the urgency of fighting had cleared and she could see the open ground in front of her. "I'm going to keep working here," she said, "and rebuild my own property. Properly this time. Not just keeping it alive, but actually building it into something." She paused. "I've been in survival mode for 2 years. I think it's time to stop surviving and start making decisions." "Good decisions?" "I'm hoping so." Margaret glanced toward the barn, where Daniel Hart had appeared briefly in the doorway, and then, seeing them, had disappeared back inside. "And what about him?" Clara followed her gaze. "What about him?" "Don't be coy," Margaret said. "I'm 63 years old. I have no patience for coy." Clara almost smiled. "It's complicated." "It's always complicated," Margaret said. The question is whether it's worth it. Clara thought about the framed $10 bill on the corner of her desk. She thought about, I think you know why. She thought about the Saturday evening on the porch when she had said, I see what you are, and she had meant every word. Yes, she said simply. It's worth it. Margaret Dole gave a single nod, as if a question she had been carrying had been answered to her satisfaction. Good, she said. Men who deserve a yes don't get them often enough. She got back on her horse and rode away without staying for coffee. Clara stood in the yard for a moment after she left. Then she went inside to find Daniel. She found him in the barn, which was where she always found him when he was thinking about something. She had learned that about him over 6 months, that he processed things physically, that when something was turning over in his mind, he needed to be doing something with his hands. He was fixing a bridle he had probably fixed already. She leaned against the stall door. Margaret's gone, she said. I know, I heard her leave. He kept working. She say what she came to say? Yes. Good. A pause. What did she say? That I did something she didn't think one person could do. His hands stilled for a moment, then kept moving. She's right. She also asked about you, Clara said. Now he looked up. She asked if it was worth it, Clara said. The complicated part. He held the bridle in his hands and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was his version of complete honesty. What did you tell her? I told her yes. The barn was very quiet. Daniel Hart set the bridle down. He walked toward her slowly. Not rushed, never rushed. Everything he did had the quality of intention. And he stopped close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes was not actually gray, but something between gray and blue, depending on the light. Clara, he said. I know, she said. I want to say it. She waited. I love you, he said. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a performance, just plainly. The way he said everything that mattered, like the truth was a fact that deserved to be stated clearly, and then stood behind without flinching. I have loved you since you walked through my gate and asked me to buy your horse for $10. Since you stood in my yard with $3.25 and refused to look like someone who had been beaten. I've been... He stopped, started again. I've been trying to give you the space to find your own footing, because you needed that more than you needed me saying this. But I'm done being quiet about it. She looked at him. 6 months ago, she had stood at this man's gate with nothing but a horse and a pride she was hanging on to by sheer force of will. She had walked through that gate expecting a transaction, money for an animal, clean and uncomplicated. She had not expected what she found instead, a man who saw her worth when she could barely see it herself, who stepped back far enough to let her rediscover it, who made his feelings known and then waited, with a patience she had never encountered in another human being, for her to be ready. She was ready. She reached up and put her hand against his face. The same deliberate gesture as on the porch, but fuller now, with nothing held back. And she said, I know. I've known for a while. How long is a while? Since the night you told me about your father, she said. On the porch with the coffee. I knew then, and I was afraid, and I handled it the way I handle things I'm afraid of. I worked harder. He put his hand over hers, where it rested against his jaw. And now I'm done working harder to avoid something good, she said. He leaned down and kissed her. She had not let herself imagine this. Or she had imagined it once, briefly, and then shut the door on it firmly. So she was not prepared for the specific quality of it. Not urgent or desperate, but deep and unhurried in the way of someone who has been patient for a long time and is not about to rush the thing they've been waiting for. When she stepped back, she felt like something structural inside her had quietly rearranged itself. All right, she said, because she needed to say something, and everything else felt too large. All right, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. I'm still working here. Good. And I'm still rebuilding my own property. I know. And the $3.40 is still coming out of my wages. He almost laughed. It already did. I know, she said. I did the accounts. She walked out of the barn. She did not look back, because she knew if she did, she would see him watching her with that unguarded expression, and she needed a few minutes to absorb what had just happened before she had to be competent at anything. She went to the account room. She sat down. She looked at the framed $10 bill. Not a debt. She thought, no, it never was. The last piece of it came on an October morning that arrived cold and bright. The kind of morning that reminds you, winter is coming but hasn't arrived yet, so everything is still possible. Daniel told her at breakfast. They had fallen into the quiet habit of sharing the first cup of coffee before the working day began, without making a ceremony of it. That he had something to show her. On her property. Her 60 acres. She looked at him. What did you do? Come and see, he said. She rode with him the 8 miles east. The air was sharp, and she could feel it through her coat, but she was warm anyway, from something that had nothing to do with the weather. They rode through her gate, with her father's name still visible on the old wood post, the one she had never taken down because she couldn't bring herself to, and she saw it. The roof on the house was new. Clean timber, properly fitted, not the patched and worried thing she had been nursing along since 2019. The north fence, the one that had collapsed in the winter storms, the one she had never fully gotten back to rights, was rebuilt. Posts solid, wire taut, everything plumb and level. The garden plot had been turned and rested and dressed with new soil. She stopped Ranger. She stared. When? She said. Over the summer, Daniel said. Cutter and Roy, weekends mostly. They asked me if they could. She turned to look at him. They asked you. They asked me if they could help fix your place. I said yes. A pause. I told you about it. You absolutely did not tell me about it. I told you I was asking first about things, he said. This is me asking after the fact, which I acknowledge is imperfect. She looked at the fence. She looked at the roof. She thought about Cutter. Hard-jawed, skeptical Cutter. Spending his Saturdays building fence on a woman's property because he had decided, somewhere along the line, that it was the right thing to do. She thought about Roy, who left coffee on her desk and fixed her water bucket and had, apparently, been building fences on weekends. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. I need to pay them, she said. They didn't want payment. I know what they didn't want. I'm paying them anyway. That's fair, Daniel said. She rode slowly forward, through the yard, to the front of the house. She dismounted. She stood at the door of the house where she had been born, where her father had built every wall with his own hands, where she had held his hand while he died, where she had stood alone in the kitchen at night in the dark, and asked herself how much longer she could do this. She put her hand on the door. She went inside. The house smelled of fresh wood and new plaster. Someone had cleaned it, really cleaned it, not the quick wipe down she'd been managing, but the deep kind. The stove had been blacked. The window glass was clear. She walked through every room. She stood in the back room, the room where her father had died, and she let herself stand there without bracing, without the automatic tightening that had accompanied every visit to this room for 18 months. She just stood in it. It was a room, her father's room. The walls he had built were still standing. He had told her, the land doesn't care if you're tired, it only cares if you show up. She had showed up. Every single time, she had showed up. She walked back outside. Daniel was standing where she'd left him, holding both horses, not going anywhere. That patience, that remarkable, specific patience. She walked up to him. She took Ranger's reins. He would have liked you, she said. Daniel looked at her. He understood immediately who she meant. Your father. Yes, he would have seen you clearly. She paused. He was good at seeing people clearly. It's the thing I miss most about him. You have it too, Daniel said quietly. She thought about that. I lost it for a while. I know, he said. You found it again. She looked at her father's house. She looked at the fence, straight and solid. She looked at the garden plot waiting for spring. She looked at 60 acres of land that had almost been taken from her by a compound interest clause and a man with clean boots, and was still hers. Then she looked at Daniel Hart, who had refused to buy her horse, who had given her work with dignity instead of pity, who had loved her quietly for 6 months and waited without demanding, who had sent men with hammers and timber to fix her roof on weekends without telling her, and who was standing in her yard right now holding her horse with the patient, undemanding presence of someone who intends to keep showing up. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the roof. Not for the fence. For all of it. For the full, cumulative weight of it. Everything from the first. I don't want to buy your horse to this moment, this October morning, this open field." He shook his head once. "You did the hard part." "We both did," she said. He considered that. "Fair," he said. She mounted Ranger. She looked out over the 60 acres. Ranger moved beneath her. That familiar, steady rhythm she had known for 12 years. The horse her father had given her. The horse she had almost sold for $10. The horse that had carried her to a gate she'd never been through before on the worst morning of a very hard year. Some things, she understood now, you hold on to not because holding on is easy, but because what you're holding is worth every difficult thing that came with it. Some things are worth every bit of the cost. She had paid the cost. She had come through it. And standing on her father's land on a cold October morning, with a good man beside her and 60 acres under her feet, and a horse that had never once let her down, Clara Whitmore finally, completely, and without reservation, believed that she had earned every good thing that was coming next. She was done surviving.